Me. It's always fun to talk to CNPS groups, my fellow plant lovers of the world, fellow California plant lovers of the world. And yeah, I'm going to go a little bit outside of the bounds of a traditional botany talk since I'm more of an ecologist than a botanist. But then I can also see from even from your upcoming talk that you don't do strictly, botany talks, but kind of more broadly just love and appreciation of our native California ecosystems. So I'll be talking about all kinds of things to do with serpentine, and I'll tell you more about what I mean by that. But first, Susan asked me to say a word or two about how I got into serpentine in the first place. I'm illustrating that in this slide by showing you a picture of my slightly younger self with slightly longer and less gray hair in one of my favorite places, Sensitive Plant Canyon, as some of the locals call it, near the border of Lake and Napa County. That's the picture on the right, where you see the just wonderful serpentine talus slopes. A really weird, really harsh and extreme and special environment for plants. And on the left, just one of the cool plants found there. Kind of one of my favorites because it's so weird and different and kind of Dr. Seuss-like. That's Asclepias solanoana, a very different looking milkweed that kind of hugs the ground and then puts up these beautiful ball-shaped inflorescences. So just kind of an emblem of how different life is sometimes on these strange soils that we call serpentine. And I actually remember the first moment when I became aware of serpentine. It was in 1983, and a friend was taking me on a hike, and we were driving out through Napa and Lake counties and pointed to some landscapes and said, "Oh, that's serpentine." And I said, "Huh, how come the plants are the same kind of weird grayish green color as the rocks?" And he said, that's a good question. I don't know. It was one of those moments in life that affected me and that I remembered and just kind of kept coming back to somehow. So as a scientist, I became interested in these soils and rocks and the life forms they support. And I'm going to kind of take this wild tour through some of the non-botanical as well as botanical aspects of serpentine. So starting with like what it is, what are we talking about here? Then some fun facts that I learned from hanging out with people who are more like geologists and hydrologists and soil scientists. So you could call this my practicing geology without a license section of the talk. Then I'll talk a little bit about some of the evolutionary aspects of serpentine, how plants adapt to it, and how it leads sometimes to the formation of new species. Then I'll talk a little bit on my own research, and some of which has had to do with how do plants survive, or how might they survive climate change in an environment that consists of little tiny patches of rock surrounded by vastly different habitats as we have here in California. So that's where we're headed. There's a group of people around the world who just think serpentine is really cool. It's not a large group, but they include botanists, vegetation scientists, soil scientists, geologists, and beginning in, I think it was about 1990, this group of people started getting together every few years for these meetings and publishing symposium volumes and such. One of the leaders, initial leaders, Art Krukeberg, you've probably heard his name if you're interested in serpentine, because he wrote this wonderful book for enthusiastic non-specialists on California serpentine soils and their flora, but also beyond the flora, some of the other interesting aspects of them. And so over the years, kind of hanging out at the fringes of this group of people, it's how I've learned something about how the geology relates to the vegetation and the floristics. And there's even some very applied aspects to this. There's some people that are really excited about the fact that some serpentine soils contain a lot of nickel and that plants might be useful ways to find and even extract that nickel. So there's a group of serpentine fans around the world, which I have to thank for all that I've learned from them, which will be reflected in some of the things that I talk about. I also put my own toe into this pool by co-editing a book with my friend Nishi Rajakaruna, who's at Cal Poly San Luis Obispo, that took a slightly different tack. Instead of just describing what serpentine is and what it does, we tried to make the theme more, what have we learned broadly about how nature works, using serpentine as an example, because I think you'll see from this talk, if you don't know this already, serpentine is kind of an extreme example of how the physical aspects of the world, control in many ways the biological aspects of the world. So in subsequent slides, if the caption at the bottom says so-and-so chapter, that refers to a chapter that somebody kindly wrote for us on some cool aspect of serpentine when Nishi and I produced this book some years ago. So off we go. First, we have to define what we're talking about. Serpentine is colloquially used by people like me, perhaps people like you, botanists, ecologists, non-specialists, to mean the sort of category that a specialist might call ultramafic rocks and soils. So ultramafic refers to being high in magnesium, Ma, and iron, Fe. So rocks that are rich, unusually rich in magnesium and iron, and the soils formed from those rocks. And the prime examples of this are actually serpentine, which is a mineral, not a rock. So it's basically a ferromagnesian silicate. It's got lots of magnesium and iron. It does have silica, but an important thing is that it doesn't have as much silica or as much of the lighter elements like calcium, potassium, as normal rocks that we find on the Earth's continental surfaces. So that's serpentine. What a geologist would call serpentine is that mineral. Serpentinite is the name for rocks that are composed of the serpentine mineral. And the mineral takes different forms. The one that you might be most familiar with and which gave it its evocative name serpentine is this one on the left, lizardite, which has this shiny, scaly, green, snakeskin-y type of look. There's also chrysotile, which is an asbestos mineral, which just basically means any mineral that is a certain degree of long versus skinny. And so asbestos minerals, we think of them as bad things because if you inhale them, they get into your lungs and muck things up. One version of serpentine, though not the most common one, is chrysotile, which is one type of asbestos mineral. And then there's a third type called antigerite. But also what we see a lot of in our region, and I think everywhere in the world that has serpentine, is actually peridotite, which is the parent rock of serpentine. It's the thing that serpentine metamorphoses from into serpentinite. And it is just a chemically almost identical version of serpentine, but it's heavier and denser, and it contains the iron in the rock, which is why when it oxidizes, it turns red on the surface, as you see in the picture on the right there. And actually, what we see a lot of in our local serpentine exposures is what the geologists taught me to call partially serpentinized peridotite. So it's peridotite that has partly hydrated and partly metamorphosed into serpentine. That being said, these rocks often contain veins of chrysotile, so veins of asbestos, which you can learn to identify with a hand lens. So all of these things together, all these ultramafic rocks, plus the soils that form by the breakdown of these rocks, are what your average botanist refers to as serpentine, because that's an easier thing to say and a kind of a nicer sounding word. But if you want to impress your geologist friends, call it partially serpentinized peridotite, and they'll stop in their tracks. So how did this stuff get into the Earth's terrestrial environments where we see it and we kind of look at it and notice that it's weird and different and that it supports different types of plant life? A key person in figuring out the answer to that story was the late Eldridge Moores, a geologist on the UC Davis faculty, who back in the very early 60s was part of the plate tectonics revolution. People had just finally figured out that, yes, continents move around, and a big, conveyor belt that creates the Earth's surface is oceanic plates forming and moving out and spreading and running into continental plates, which are lighter rocks in terms of composition. And so the oceanic plates, which form at these mid-ocean spreading centers, end up subducting or diving under the continental plates. And that gives rise to all the phenomena that we're so familiar with in California, like earthquakes and volcanoes, basic plate tectonic stuff. Eldridge, at that time in 1961, when this revolution was going on, very exciting time, everyone could see the subduction process because it happens at the edges of continents where you can sort of witness it or measure the signs of it. But nobody knew what the formation of these ocean crust plates looked like. And Eldridge figured out that there are these bodies of rock on the continental surface that are the signatures or the traces of those mid-ocean spreading centers. And the name ophiolites has been given to this cluster of rocks that are shown on the right here. Peridotite, which is basically the material that the Earth's mantle is made of. Serpentinite, which is a metamorphic byproduct caused by hydration when the peridotite comes into contact with the ocean. And then gabbro, chert, and basalt, which are all involved in this process of forming new oceanic plates in the middle of the ocean at these very deep spreading centers. So these dense, heavy oceanic crust rocks form, they move outward, they end up colliding with the continent, and little bits of them get scraped onto the continental surface or stuck on the continental surface in a number of different ways. But the fact that they're always found together kind of tells you something about how they all had a common origin in the middle of the ocean. And so this is where our serpentine comes from. And so when you find it, in most cases, when you find serpentine on the continental surface of the Earth, you are looking at a present or former boundary between an oceanic plate and a continental plate that it subducted underneath. And if you're at all familiar with California geology, you know that that's how California formed over about the last 200 million years, with these oceanic crust plates coming in from the west and sliding under a series of expanding continental formations to the east. So somewhere in this process, serpentine gets scraped off onto the continent, and then later on, sometimes these subduction zones stop subducting and they get uplifted into mountainous zones. And so these rocks that come from the ocean's crust get thrust upward and become exposed. And then that's when you have your serpentine on land or your ophiolites on land. And this is the best map that I was able to find of where this happens all over the world. So you can easily recognize in this the Pacific Rim of Fire all the way around from Western North America to Eastern Asia, where subduction is still actively going on. The Caribbean and Southeast Asia, two other places where a lot of active subduction is going on, but also in a lot of other places, like, for example, the Appalachian zone in the eastern US, where there's no subduction happening anymore, but the serpentine that's there is a trace of events that happened long ago in the past. Here's a kind of more precise view of where we see serpentine in California. And as you can see, there's a big band. Actually, it's a number of bands kind of squished together throughout the Sierra Nevada foothills, and another kind of series of bands throughout the Coast Ranges. If you've ever read Assembling California by John McPhee, you can learn a sort of a poetic, literary version of the story of how those things got there. But it was basically the story of Western North America being built out by a series of plate collisions that left increasing amounts of land stuck to the growing west edge of the continent. And at some point, I think it was about 40 million years ago, this subduction suddenly jumped from where the Sierra foothills are now to where the Coast Range is now, because basically a big chunk of ocean crust got stuck in the middle. And somewhere deep under the Central Valley where I live is this immense slab of serpentine that underpins our whole Central Valley, which is why we have this big weird flat valley. And then the whole subduction process just started up over again, farther west, where we now have the Coast Ranges. And then up in the far north, the northwest of the state, you have these two very big serpentine areas, the Trinity ophiolite around Mount Shasta, just west of Mount Shasta, and the Josephine ophiolite in the very northwest corner and lapping over into southern Oregon. And these are not kind of squished off pieces of ocean crust. These are actually the entire floor of ancient oceans that got stuck there by means that are a lot more complicated than what I just described. That's essentially why you have these very big and very botanically interesting expanses of ultramafic rocks in that area in the northwestern part of the state. The details of the geology get incredibly complicated. What you can also see in this picture is that this basic substrate spread throughout California accumulates really interesting plant communities that differ a lot depending on where you are. In the Northwest, there's a lot of kind of sparse, stunted conifer forest, a lot of open talus barrens. As you move into the central part of California, you see a lot of chaparral. And the farther you go south into more arid areas, the more you get into grasslands on Serpentine. And there's only a few places in the state where the Serpentine actually meets the ocean, but one of them is shown in the lower left here. It's Jade Beach in Big Sur. And so everywhere you see it, it's got interesting vegetation, but it's far from all the same. And just to give a little international flavor here, here's some serpentine in South Africa. And you can also see that it supports unusual vegetation. And I'm going to let you guess where this exposure of serpentine is. So I think it'll be kind of obvious from the billboard. I had the rare privilege of going here in about 2001 with some serpentine botanists. It's very, very botanically interesting. This is actually, Cuba and New Caledonia are the world's two biggest hotspots for sheer number of endemic plants on serpentine soils. Okay, but here's my fun facts. In the next 10 minutes, I'll try to convince you that serpentine might be responsible for the origin of life, that it could support life on other planets, it could stop global warming, and a few other things. And of course, I'm being a little tongue-in-cheek here, but not entirely tongue-in-cheek, so bear with me. And now these are things that I learned from some of my fun colleagues that I met in the course of, things like editing this book. It turns out when peridotite, which is essentially the stuff the Earth's mantle is made of, gets into these environments in which it's kind of oozes up to the oceanic crust. It's exposed to seawater. It's at incredibly high pressures, but not extremely high temperatures. That's when it combines with water, it hydrates. Peridotite turns into serpentine. That's serpentinization. Gives off a proton, gives off a hydrogen atom. And this process creates a potential energy source for microbes. These are anaerobic microbes. They're both bacteria and archaea, these very, very ancient life forms. And they can harness those protons as a chemical source of energy in a totally anaerobic, abiotic environment. And it's now known that this process, these microbes that live in the serpentinizing environment, can be found both in the mid-ocean spreading centers down at depths of 5,000 meters in the ocean, which is what you see over here on the left. This Lost City hydrothermal field is a place where this process is going on. It's also found relatively near the Earth's surface in some places. This absolutely exceptional serpentine exposure in Sonoma County called the Cedars. Back in the 60s, somebody discovered that serpentinization was going on only a few hundred meters below the Earth's surface. But these and many other serpentinizing environments support an absolutely massive form of life that wasn't known until fairly recently, which is all these anaerobic bacteria and archaea. And these are some of the chemical reactions that they're making their livings off of. Well, not only is this interesting itself, and Don Cardes, who wrote a chapter about it for our book, makes the claim that this could be collectively the largest life form on Earth, subsurface serpentinizing microbes. But also, this is an environment that would have been in existence and relatively hospitable even in the early Earth. Even when temperatures were extreme and there was no oxygen, this environment would have been there, and life forms could have lived there, not subjected to extreme temperatures, not subjected to other kind of extreme events like meteorite collisions. And we now know through genetic techniques that the enzymes that they use for these reactions are very ancient. And so this is at least a candidate. It's been suggested to be a candidate for where life could have first evolved. The ingredients were there, the reactions are simple. There wouldn't have been these big physical challenges to the early assembly of living molecules. So who knows, but it's a theory that people have floated. Not only that, all those ingredients are there on other planets. Mars is largely made of peridotite. Mars has water, or at least has had water in the past. And it's known that serpentine occurs on Mars, so serpentinization must have happened there. So when exobiologists examine rocks taken from other planets, they are looking for some of the same signals that they see in rocks collected on Earth, where serpentinizing microbes have lived, to try to see if they see some of the same fingerprints. So it's been an active area of interest for exobiology. And this is just to show that it's not only Mars, but other places in the solar system that have these ingredients because there are meteorites that have serpentine. So that's kind of cool. Not only is this rock out there in the rest of the universe, but chemical reactions that are the potential basis for life. Okay, moving on. It has also been seriously suggested, more than seriously suggested, that serpentine could be a way to geoengineer a solution to not only global warming, but to the CO2 increase that underpins global warming, because the magnesium in serpentine can, under the right conditions, react with CO2 and form magnesium carbonate, which is very stable. In fact, you could build buildings out of it. So people have been very interested in what this article calls the mineral resource base for CO2 sequestration, which is basically serpentine. That's why this map looks like the geologic map that I showed you earlier. And I've been contacted by people saying, hey, do you know any places where I could do this research on CO2 sequestration? The only problem being that to actually effect this would involve kind of mining and crushing and chemically treating the serpentine at a massive scale that would probably have a rather large energy footprint. So I don't think anyone has made that sort of pencil out yet, but there's certainly been a lot of interest, and you can even read about it in the New York Times as of 6 years ago. So getting a little less cosmic and getting a little more botanical, since you're probably waiting for some plants. Another cool thing about serpentine relates to its hydrology. A lot of rocks that have aquifers in them are porous. And so like in sandstone or limestone, water would move through pores in the rocks, and that's what would give you springs and streams. Serpentine, the rock itself, is quite impermeable, but because it's been sort of metamorphosed and crushed and ground up and squished into subduction zones and then faulted up to the surface, it tends to exist as these shattered masses of rock. And so the aquifers in serpentine are actually fractures, not pores. And that makes at least some serpentine exposures like giant sponges. So when a rainstorm hits in winter, you have this big peak on the hydrograph, lots of runoff, but you also have this really, really long tail on the hydrograph as the water moves through those cracks and crevices. And the result of that is that a lot of streams have their headwaters on serpentine. And these streams oftentimes flow into times of year that everything else around is dry. And streams coming from other geologies are dry. This is that same stream that I showed you the picture of myself at the beginning of the talk. And you can tell it's on serpentine because that white encrustation is magnesium sulfate or Epsom, which precipitates out as the water dries. That's a kind of a footprint of a stream that's come from serpentine headwaters. But it's a super cool environment for plants because in the middle of the summer, even though it's very, very hot, plants not only have plenty of water, but they have the kind of freedom from the shading and competition that they would have on a more fertile soil. And so you get some really cool plants that are only found in these serpentine seeps. I've shown here serpentine sunflower, Helianthus exilus, and of course, wonderful, cobra plant, Darlingtonia californica, which is not entirely endemic to serpentine, but geez, I've seen it about twice on other geologies and like hundreds of times on serpentine because that's just the perfect environment for it. So that's kind of a cool thing. On the more negative side, you wouldn't really want to put a building or a road on serpentine. It's very shattered, weak, friable rock. And this is just a little excerpt from a recent report on why we're having all these landslides that are causing Highway 1 to fail throughout Big Sur. And it basically says the very worst landslides on Highway 1 and Big Sur are where you have a lot of serpentine. It's just a terrible thing to try to build anything on because it's just structurally weak rock. On the other hand, because it's sort of a weak, soft rock, You can do fun stuff with it. And everything from ancient Mesopotamian art to traditional Inuit art to modern day Zimbabwean art to Renaissance buildings in Tuscany and some serpentine that I had a local jeweler make some necklaces out of in Oregon can easily be made from serpentine, and its beautiful colors are very attractive. And of course, these Renaissance buildings are not made of serpentine; they're made of something much stronger. But then they put a kind of a decorative facing on it that where the dark greens come from serpentine. So I hope I've convinced you that serpentine has some fun things about it besides the plants. But moving on to the plants, since we're all botanists here, or at least plant lovers here, I'll first talk just a little bit about plant adaptations and a little bit about plant speciation, because these are some of the very, very fascinating things. If you think of serpentine as a model system for anything, it's really ecological in evolutionary adaptation and the formation of new species that have drawn people, scientists, to it for many, many decades. So what is so tough about this? Why is serpentine weird for plants? There was a soil scientist in the 40s and 50s, Hans Jenny, who answered that question by saying it's not any one thing, it's a syndrome. It's like this whole bundle of things that goes together. I think the best way to explain it is it really starts with way too much magnesium and way too little calcium. If you're a plant, you need calcium to build your cell walls. It's not only is it a problem that serpentine has very little calcium, but to make it even worse, magnesium occupies some of the same binding sites in the soil that calcium would occupy because they're very chemically similar. They're in the same series. And so it's really tough to just deal with this extreme scarcity of calcium if you're a plant on serpentine. And I think if you want to talk about a primary reason why it's a bad environment for plants, that would be the one. Um, Add to that, potassium and calcium are also light elements that are scarce on serpentine. Add to that since plant life is sparse and slowly growing, the whole cycling of primary nutrients like NPK is greatly slowed down. And then the soils are often shallow, they're often full of rocks, so that lessens the water holding volume there, so that it becomes effectively dry. And there are also trace heavy metals like nickel, which has been of a lot of interest to people because of its potential economic implications. So pretty much wherever you look at serpentine compared to the other soils nearby, you're going to see lower plant cover, lower plant biomass, lower litter cover, and then some of these chemical signatures like very high calcium, low magnesium, and so on. These are fairly universal things about serpentine. In California, where we have a little over 5,000 native plants, about 4,000 of them either never grow on serpentine or hardly ever grow on serpentine. And so to call these avoiders is a simple way to sum it up. And compared to that, only about maybe 1,000 to 1,200 species are able to grow on it. And then a small subset of those are actually relatively restricted to it, which we then call endemics. And so pretty much anytime or most of the time when you look at serpentine, you're going to see these boundaries like are shown in this picture. So forest on non-serpentine going to very sparse open forest on serpentine, lush oak woodland going to open forb-dominated grasslands, forest in the lower left, you have forest going to chaparral, and on the lower right, you have a kind of a mixed chaparral on serpentine going to a totally different species composition on the non-serpentine. So the first thing you're gonna see is the lack of all these normally dominant species because just so many species are not capable of growing on it. Or if they do, it's like one plant here, one plant there, but a huge change in dominance. So these tolerators are pretty interesting because they are plants that have the capability to grow on a really terrible soil, even though they're not dependent on growing on that terrible soil. So how do they do that? I'm going to present that there's sort of two broadly different pathways or two different types of adaptations that plants have to serpentine. One I'll call serpentine-specific adaptations, and those would be things basically to do with calcium and magnesium. How do you take up calcium even though it's very scarce? How do you exclude the magnesium, exclude, if applicable, the magnesium? Um, and one way that people have studied that is by looking at certain tolerators like Achillea, yarrow, very familiar plant, which have so-called serpentine ecotypes. They have within species genetic variation. And so some populations have adaptations to do well on serpentine and others don't. And so if you can determine that by simple transplant experiments. And then you can look more closely at those two different genetic ecotypes and try to figure out how they differ. And so that can be really interesting. And in recent years, with all of what we call the omics techniques, genomics and proteomics, a few people have gotten interested in drilling right down and finding out what genes and what enzymes would make a plant capable of growing on serpentine. And so some colleagues of mine jokingly called this line of inquiry serpentinomics. It's not a real word, they just made it up. But here's a really nice example. Toby Bradshaw at University of Washington took Arabidopsis thaliana, the lab rat of plant genetic studies, and used what are called knockout lines, where you have a whole series of an inbred line of a plant, and each subline of that has one gene deactivated, so-called knockout lines. Then you screen all these lines against a challenge. In this case, the challenge is a very low calcium to magnesium ratio. And he found that out of 1,000 different mutations, there was one that allowed seedlings of Arabidopsis to survive. And it was basically a gene that creates a so-called calcium antiporter, an enzyme that shoves calcium into vacuoles so that the plant's cytoplasm, the cell's fluids, maintain a really strong gradient that can pull scarce calcium into the cell. So that was kind of cool. A really nice example of an adaptation that would be very helpful to a species evolving the ability to live on serpentine. But there's also this other whole category of traits that to me are really interesting, which I'll call the just general stress tolerator traits. These are traits that you would see in pretty much any plant species growing in a really low productivity, slow growth environment. So some of these same traits you would find on other harsh soils, or you would even find some of them in environments where the growing period is very short, like high Arctic environments, for example. So things like evergreenness, high wood density, being perennial rather than annual, just having a kind of a generally slow life cycle and slow but steady resource acquisition. These are all things that sort of help plants survive in low resource environments. And to me, these ones are super interesting because they have so many implications for how whole ecosystems function. What do I mean by that? Well, if you go to Art Krukelberg's book, you can see this pair of photos taken at the New Idria Serpentine Barrens in San Benito County, some 40 years apart. And if you look closely, you'll struggle to find any differences, right? Because this is just such a slow growth environment. These plants live a long time. They don't grow much. They don't reproduce much. And so you just have an ecosystem where the dynamics are incredibly slow. One consequence of that is because the growth and dynamics are so slow, disturbance is also less important to how the ecosystem functions. So a colleague of mine and I compared the fire ecology of nearby serpentine and non-serpentine chaparral, and we found some substantial differences. In non-serpentine chaparral, when a fire happens, you get this big spike in diversity. And the number of plant species in a plot can more than double because there's so many plants that are adapted to use that window of time after the competitors have been kind of cleared out by a fire. And then, only 3 or 4 years later, the system is sort of back to its approximate pre-fire condition. And that doesn't happen on serpentine. The fire comes through and diversity doesn't increase very much. And it takes the system longer to get back to its kind of pre-fire appearance. And we think that's basically because just competition is less acute in serpentine, and the opportunities provided by a fire to kind of flourish in the absence of competition are not as important. So that's kind of an interesting kind of higher level ecological type of difference. Um, I've also found in some work that I've done that serpentine plants don't seem to care quite as much in broad terms about climate. So what you have here is a gradient from a lush semi-coastal Sonoma County environment to a harsh interior dry climate in Lake County. And as you go along that gradient, the non-serpentine vegetation changes dramatically from kind of lush conifer forest to sparse stunted chaparral. Along the same gradient, serpentine vegetation remains almost identical. It's leather oak chaparral in both places with very few differences in species composition. So there's this kind of toughness and resistance to the environment that I think characterizes serpentine plants. And there's not very many animals on serpentine in general. There's just kind of a generally lower animal biomass, lower animal diversity, and it's pretty hard to point to any animals that are only found on serpentine, although I'm showing you here one exception to that, which is a butterfly whose larvae feed on the serpentine endemic small tree, Sargent cypress. So really handsome little hair streak butterfly. But in general, it's very, very hard to point to serpentine specialist animals. It's just a low productivity environment that does not support much of a food web. Okay, new plant species. How do they arise? I'm going to be real, fairly brief about this. It's not my area of specialty. It's just a cool area. Plus, I know that probably most of you are here because you just are crazy, as I am, about these really interesting localized endemic species that you have to go to serpentine in a particular geographic area to find. And they're just really wonderful gems of botanical diversity. They tend, on average, to have very small ranges, small geographic ranges. And so they've fascinated evolutionary biologists for a long time. So one way that such a species could arise is through what an evolutionist would call ecological speciation, where adaptation to a new environment kind of fortuitously leads to a new species budding off from its ancestor. So the key thing here is that the ancestral species does not grow on serpentine. It's not a tolerator. And then there's some lineage that just has this mutation. And this mutation, this mutant strain, which is more tolerant of serpentine, just happens by sheer chance, 1 in a million chance, to land on some serpentine. And it survives, and by another 1 in a million chance, it survives long enough to slowly adapt over time. And then over time, given enough time, adaptation to this new environment leads to reproductive isolation, where it's no longer able to interbreed with its ancestor. And that's the key part, because evolutionists will tell you that's a very improbable thing, that the default is that the descendant population will just kind of merge back into its ancestor because of gene flow, just because they're not, it's very hard for reproductive isolation to evolve. But it does sometimes happen on serpentine. And I think roughly half of our serpentine endemics in California, give or take, could be attributed to this pathway. And by far the best studied example is this pair of Leia species studied by Bruce Baldwin at Berkeley, where the ancestor Leia glandulosa is widespread and the descendant endemic species Leia discoidea is only found in the New Idria area of San Benito County. Really, really nice work on this. So that's one way to evolve from a non-tolerant ancestor to a serpentine endemic descendant. The other pathway is to evolve from a serpentine tolerant ancestor to a serpentine restricted descendant. And this has sometimes been called the paleoendemic pathway because the ancient state is to not be endemic, and then the endemic state arises not because the species adapts to serpentine, but because it loses its ability to grow on non-serpentine. Probably the best, easiest to explain example of this comes from the Streptanthus glandulosus complex. Streptanthus glandulosus, this really lovely jewel flower, grows all over the California coast ranges on all types of kind of bare open areas, far from, it grows on serpentine, but is far from restricted to it. But it's got a couple of really cool daughter species. one of which is totally endemic to the serpentine of the Tiburon Peninsula. You can find it at Ring Mountain Reserve, the Tiburon jewelflower. It's got these, modestly different traits that reliably distinguish it from glandulosus. The other one is the Metcalf Canyon jewelflower, found only on this great big serpentine outcrop south of San Jose on the east side of Highway 101. And so this has white flowers, and it's a subspecies of Streptanthus albilis, the most beautiful jewel flower, which has pink flowers. Again, modestly distinct from glandulosus. But the key thing here is both of these, or all three of these species, phylogenetically, in terms of evolutionary relationships, they're all completely embedded within Streptanthus glandulosus. So basically, the scenario is you have this widespread species, and then a few populations, for whatever reason, kind of get cut off from their closest relatives and isolated onto serpentine, perhaps just because the competitive environment around them changed and they didn't have the opportunities to grow on other substrates. And then they had the opportunity to evolve some slightly differentiating traits. So this is the other pathway. It's kind of a widespread ancestor becomes a more localized serpentine restricted descendant. So these are really fun things to think about, at least. But the last thing I'll say, since I don't want to take too much of your time here, is a little bit about some of my work that ended up turning into, kind of having a climate change hook, because it's pretty impossible these days to think about nature without at least thinking something about climate change. And there's been this long-standing idea that as climate changes, it might interact with habitat fragmentation. So if you look on the left, you see the kind of the scenario that people often think about when they're trying to make predictions about how biodiversity will change. They say, well, here's a species, here's its current climate envelope. Now we can run that through a model and ask, where will those same climate conditions occur in the future? Well, they'll occur farther north or higher in elevation. And will that species shift? Will it make it to its future climate niche? Well, we don't know. That's a hard thing to say. But you can make two bracketing assumptions. One is that species are good dispersers. They'll get to that future climate range, so great. The other is that they're terrible dispersers, and therefore, whatever you want to look at, like 100 years from now, they might only survive in the places where there's overlap between their current range and their future range. Okay, so that's all well and good. That's how a lot of projections are done. If you read reports about predictions of biodiversity change 100 years from now, that is the type of model that they'll be based on. But as people have often pointed out, what about species that are living in fragmented habitats? Now, mostly when people talk about that, they're thinking about something like tropical forest fragmentation or something like that. But what about species that are restricted by, let's say, soil requirements? What about, say, serpentine endemics? They face a different scenario because not only do they have to kind of shift to that future climate envelope, they have to do it by leapfrogging from one suitable habitat patch to another. We actually estimated with a little bit of modeling that a typical serpentine plant in California, to track its climate over the next 100 years, would have to routinely make jumps of like anywhere from 10 to more kilometers. And when you think about that, the probability of that is really low. A little seed of a plant blowing for 10 kilometers and then happening to land on another serpentine outcrop. It's a pretty tough expectation for plants to meet. So does that mean that these soil endemic plants are really in trouble? That turned out to be a good enough rationale for my friend Ellen Damshin and me to get an NSF grant some years ago. And off we went to Southern Oregon because a study had been done in Southern Oregon back in the 1950s by Robert Whitaker, a plant ecologist, examining the vegetation on serpentine and neighboring non-serpentine soils over a large geographic area that's very, very rich in botanical diversity. And we came up with the idea of resurveying as closely as possible Whitaker's plots some 50 plus years later, which turned out to be the most fabulous scientific botanical adventure of my entire life. Really, really cool, fun, interesting project. And what we ended up finding through that study and through a number of other studies and through reviewing the literature, what we realized is that although changes have happened and you can detect those changes, on the whole, there's a lot of different lines of evidence that suggest that plants on these tough, infertile soils, serpentine and others, seem to respond less to climate change, whether it's normal annual fluctuation in climate or paleo, 100,000 and 10,000 years ago to present climatic variation or 50 years ago to present climatic warming. In every case, the majority of the evidence suggests that plants that have these adaptations to live on tough, challenging, difficult soils just kind of shrug off climate change to some extent compared to neighboring plant communities on more fertile soils, which we attribute to the traits of the plants, things like the slow growth and the evergreenness and the kind of tough, thick leaves and all those kinds of adaptations. They seem to convey a certain amount of climate resilience. Um, but the changes are there. And another really fun spin-off of our project was a kind of an assisted migration study. And we showed that if you take some serpentine plants from lowland Southern Oregon, put them up into cooler microsites up higher in the mountains, they actually do better than in their home sites. So there is evidence that the climate is changing and plants are not entirely keeping up with it. So I don't want to at all dismiss the significance of climate change. This is a study where we transplanted 3 species from a 400-meter elevation home site to a whole array of higher sites. And what these lines indicate is how well those species did when we put them at higher locations compared to home, and then whether they did better with their neighboring plants or without their neighboring plants. That's why there's 2 lines in each graph. And these were Phacelia, uh, Phacelia hastata and Quercus sericata. And that's my former postdoc, Marko Spazievich, doing this study. So that's pretty much what I had to say, and I would be very pleased to take any questions from you.
Well, that is amazing. That's that's really great.
Thank you.
I'm that was so helpful.
Okay, good.
Um, Thank you so much for giving us such a great background in serpentine. There was so much I didn't know.
You can tell us my favorite subject, can't you?
It's really helpful for me, for instance, when I do advocacy, to be able to look at that chart and go, okay, great. Somebody has published something about when California native plants are planted together, they do better.
No, uh-huh.
So short takeaways like that are amazing. Um,
Good.
let's see, we have got, oh, I'm assuming it's Bob Hall as the other person signed in as the CMPS Yerba Buena, is saying that you can see Muir's hair streak in Marin on the Pine Mountain Trail.
Oh, cool.
And let's see, I know we've got a couple of questions in the Q&A. Got a few. Oh, asking about mycelium presence in serpentine soils.
Hmm. Yeah, some people have been really interested to see whether mycorrhizae play a greater role or a different role, or if they're differentiated, genetically or at the species level between serpentine and non-serpentine environments. So there are a few papers out there, but I would say overall it's not super well explored, and I don't have any great take homes on that. I don't think at the time we wrote that edited book that I showed you, I don't think there was enough work on that was something we could cover. But certainly you would expect that, mutualisms would play a greater role in a harsh, nutrient poor environment like that.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And Yvonne is asking if the beach in Big Sur is called Jade Beach because of the polished serpentine on the shore.
Yeah, and there's a particular type of jade called nephrite that is actually a type of serpentine. You know, it's not very common, but I think in both Jade Beach and there's a few places in far northwestern California where nephrite jade occurs, and so it's sort of a very close geological relative to the serpentine. So it is actual jade, and I've heard that people actually go scuba diving at Jade Beach looking for chunks of jade below the surface, and it's
That's
quite valuable.
yeah. And Yvonne is asking a bunch of good questions. One of them, how large was the area you resurveyed 50 years after the original survey?
Ooh, well, it was a large in terms of overall extent. If you're familiar with that part of the world at all, the Serpentine was all along Weimer Road, which starts in O'Brien, Oregon, and comes out at Smith River, California, and it traverses 50 miles of extremely rugged, mostly serpentine landscape. And Whitaker's sites were spread out along about the first 12 miles of his serpentine sites were spread out along about the first 12 miles of Weimer Road, going from about 1,200 to 4,000 feet elevation, something like that. Really, really, really botanically rich area. His non-serpentine sites were kind of smattered around the Illinois Valley of Southern Oregon, but most of them were around Caves Monument. So going from Cave Junction up to the monument where the caves are, again, about 1,200 to 4,000. Then there are a few higher elevation sites, like there's a few going up to 6 or 7,000 feet. Again, maybe I think that whole road is maybe 18 miles long, something like that. But it's a good ways. It's, probably as the crow flies, 10, 15 miles from the serpentine sites. He also had gabbro sites, and they were along the Illinois River. Um, this wouldn't mean anything to anybody. Well, it's around the beginning of the Rogue River, the Illinois River Trail. We didn't end up resurveying the gabbro sites because they had all been burned at high intensity 7 years earlier in the Biscuit Fire. And so there wasn't really any valid way to compare past to present while excluding the influence of this high severity fire. So yeah, they were rather geographically spread out.
Wow, that's amazing.
Yeah, it was an adventure. It was a huge adventure. Probably
I'm
never do anything like that again.
why?
Mm. Well, you definitely need a study buddy.
What's the advantage of a study buddy?
Oh, it's just so challenging that you kind of need, one person couldn't do it. Ellen was much better at some of the technical stuff, GPS mapping, database organizing. I did kind of more of the figuring out the botany and the history and the logistics, but she brought in a lot of technical skills, and we gave each other a lot of moral support through a lot of challenging adventures.
Amazing. Yvonne's got another question. Wait, did the ancient peoples have, or the indigenous peoples have any special use for the serpentine-rich rocks and soil?
That's such a wonderful question, and I've been super curious about that, and I've floated that question out to people from time to time. Never gotten too many answers, so I can't answer that for sure. I think that one thing I learned a long time ago from a archaeologist who did contract work, like the pre-development archaeological survey work, was that some of these areas, like large areas of serpentine chaparral, would not have been inhabited, that they would have been like the hunting country. Like you would live in your village in a nicer environment where there's acorns and year-round resources of various kinds. And the serpentine areas were probably just visited for hunting. That was based on having surveyed and looked for village sites and all that kind of thing. I will say, though, that I found vastly more arrowheads on serpentine than in other environments because of the fact that there just isn't all the leaf litter and turnover of soil and everything. And so if somebody dropped an arrowhead 150 years ago, it could still be lying on the same soil surface today. But
Wow,
other than that, no, I haven't learned too much. I'd love to hear more. If there's special beliefs about it or uses of it, it'd be really fascinating to know.
that's amazing. Do you see the same array, this is from Robin, of serpentine endemics in areas with less defined serpentine soils, but partial serpentine soil?
Boy, that's so It's so complicated, that serpentine can be so distinctive and you can just look at it from a mile away and say, oh my God, there's serpentine over there. And then there's other times when the distinctions are really subtle. And I think that has a lot to do with these kind of subtleties of soil formation. Like if it's very fine alluvial soil, the imbalances of plant resources are not nearly as severe as if it's kind of freshly shattered rock and kind of talus slopes and things. So the physical properties of the soil have a huge ameliorating influence, and there are times when it is really hard to tell if you're on serpentine soil or not. And I would say in general that when it comes to like the cool endemic species that we all get excited about, they tend to be on the more extreme, like the shattered talus rock kind of surfaces and not in the, but there are some serpentine endemics that are found in only in serpentine clays.
Wow.
There's the Dutton's thorn mint at Edgewood Park, for example, that's found in these weird serpentine vertisols that are kind of these naturally churned clay soils, and they just seem to like that combination of things. Um, and there's others too. I mean, I'm not thinking of the names right now, but in general, I would say that the kind of the physical harshness, the lack of well-developed soil horizons is an important factor in what makes it a really dramatic environment that leads to the evolution of these endemic species.
Yeah, Edgewood is such a great example of someplace you can go and see some of those serpentine endemic.
Uh-huh.
So Rosemary McKeever's got a great question that I've been wondering too. Is it possible to over amend serpentine soils when you're planting
Hmm.
new plants?
Hmm. Well, let's see. What do I know about that? I know people have tried to do restoration. There's places like, to keep highways from sliding. People try to do restoration, and it's very hard to get any kind of plant life to start without amending it, right? Because stuff, even stuff that should grow there, just doesn't grow very fast, and it fails a lot of the time. And so amendments are done. Um, I mean, if you over amended it on a long-term basis, then I would think, yeah, invasive species will probably take over. But if you amend it temporarily to get things started, then that might not be so bad. But you should really read the restoration chapter in that book because that talks about those kinds of questions a lot. And honestly, I haven't tried this kind of thing. I just kind of go and look at the plants where they're growing rather than try to change the course of what's there. Certainly, if you add NPK if the soil isn't if the soil is talus, nothing you can do is probably going to change that too much on a long-term basis. But if it's a kind of a more alluvial soil and you add a bunch of NPK, yeah, I think you could change it for a long time. Especially phosphorus hangs around in soil. And you would probably, if it was a grassland, you would probably find that invasive grasses took over for a long time if you added a bunch of NPK.
Interesting. Karen has got some good questions. Are there any parasitic or hemiparasitic plants on serpentine?
Oh, let's think. Well, there's certainly a lot of, little castilleias and things, little herbaceous ones. Yeah, so they're there. Are they as prevalent as on non-serpentine soils? Yeah, I don't know. I don't know. But there's certainly plenty of the little what we used to call Scrophulariaceae on serpentine.
Ah, and Karen's also got a question about the general stress tolerator plants. Are they dwarfed on serpentine compared to where they normally occur?
Well, yeah, in some cases, if you look at like within a species, if it's got a serpentine ecotype and a non-serpentine ecotype, you would find that they're kind of smaller and shrimpier. I think a nice example of that, familiar example would be Gilia capitata. That was one of the first studies where I think Krukeberg did this back in the 50s. He did reciprocal transplants, serpentine populations and non-serpentine populations planted into serpentine soil and non-serpentine soil. And there's both a genetic and environmental component to it. I mean, the serpentine ones do okay on serpentine. But they would still be bigger if they grew a non-serpentine. It's not like they love the stuff, but they can tolerate it. But the
Oh,
non-serpentine populations just die on the serpentine. They just can't handle it. So partly, in other words, partly the Gilia on serpentine are smaller because of their genetic adaptations, and partly they're just smaller because of the harshness of the environment. And they may also, at the same time, have greater allocation to roots. I don't think Krukenberg studied that part of it. That would be very consistent with expectations if being shorter above ground also went along with allocating more to roots to kind of scavenge up those scarce resources.
interesting. And Henry asks if there are easily reachable serpentine deposits near or within San Francisco.
Yeah, well, there are some. There's, of course, serpentine at the Presidio, where the Clarkia, the Arctostaphylos, special Arctostaphylos species lives, and oh, the Clarkia franciscana location. Um, I think you can visit there and look at it. It'd be very hard to get a research permit there, as I found. But yeah, so there is this little patch of serpentine in the Presidio that's very well protected because of this rare endemic species. There is a little bit of serpentine at the southern terminus of the Golden Gate Bridge, which you can get down to by sort of, hiking down to those beaches down there, Baker Beach or whatever that is. There's some serpentine along there. Um, there's is or was, I think was a restaurant in Dogpatch called Serpentine. And there's this nice display on the wall of how that was the geology. But of course, that's all covered up now. Um, Beyond that, like the very closest places would, I mean, Marin Headlands, Marin Municipal Watershed District is great. I mean, you can hike around and see tons of cool serpentine vegetation and plants. That was probably the closest place you could have a really satisfying serpentine experience. And then as you go down farther down the peninsula, there's a number of places. Um, uh, Edgewood Park being a close one. There is some around Crystal Springs Reservoir, but I don't think I've ever been able to get access to that. There's Coyote Ridge, which is the big area south of San Jose that's along the east side of the freeway. And I think some parts of that are accessible.
Nice. Dennis asks if leather oaks are endemic to serpentine areas.
So you could probably get a certain type of person arguing about that because they are, 95% found on serpentine. And then you can occasionally, like I know a few places where I've seen them growing on sandstone. And I think that's pretty typical of serpentine plants, especially the woody species, even more so than the herbaceous species, is that they will have this very, very, very strong association with serpentine, but it's not 100%. So me being an ecologist and population biologist, I say, yeah, that's pretty good. That's endemic. But then there are, more hair splitty type of people who say if it ever grows off of serpentine, it's not an endemic. So I think based on who you ask and what definition you employ, that would either be considered a very strong indicator of serpentine or a kind of like a weak to medium strong endemic, something like that. People have actually come out with gradations of how endemic something is. My colleague Hugh Safford has a Madronio paper where he presents an entire spreadsheet of species listed by kind of an endemism score, which is just based on compiling what various floristic sources said about how closely restricted it is. I would say if you see a leather oak, you're very, very, very likely to be on serpentine. So that's good enough for me.
Yeah, it works for me too. Mary Swanson's got a good question, and I've got a side question to it. She asks if muddy puddles on serpentine after the rains are toxic to dogs, and
No.
and are plants that are planted in edible native plants that are planted on serpentine that can tolerate it, are they toxic to people or animals?
Yeah, no, I wouldn't worry about that. I have, drunk water from, streams that came out of serpentine formations many times, and it's actually delicious water because it's very, very pure, has nothing growing in it. I have heard that it can have laxative effect because if you drink a lot of serpentine, that'll kind of get things moving. But as far as toxicity, no. I mean, there's nothing in there that's toxic. I mean, nickel A isn't going to be, toxic in the kind of doses that would be soluble in water anyway. And B, from what I've understood, from what I've heard from people, like in our Californian soils, which are mostly relatively high pH, it's not even soluble, so the nickel might be there bound up in the rocks, but it doesn't dissolve, doesn't go into solution. It's not even available to plants, taking up water from the soil, let alone from free water that's lying around. So no, in fact, I think we probably drink more water coming from serpentine sources than we even realize, and it's not a problem.
Well, that's good to know.
Yeah.
Yeah, Yvonne asks if there's relatively few insects found in serpentine areas. Is this because the plants are toxic for them to feed upon?
No, again, I don't think it has much to do with toxicity, and insects in general are the world's master detoxifiers, so you have insects eating things like, milkweeds that are packed with cardiac glycosides because insects just have these wonderful enzymatic detoxification systems. So that wouldn't stop them. I think it has much more to do with just inherent low nutritional value. If plants are trying to produce leaves to last a long time so that the plant won't have to pay the cost of making new leaves all the time, then those leaves are going to be relatively low in nitrogen, high in indigestible structural carbohydrates, et cetera, et cetera. And so it just isn't much of a resource. I think it has much more to do with it than toxicity per se. Think of leather oak. Think of trying to make your living eating leather oak. It's more of that kind of thing.
Oh, yikes. Um, Joseph asks if you have any data on nematodes.
Ooh, short answer, no. Long answer, I don't even remember ever being in any conversations about nematodes in serpentine soil. So clearly, that is a research frontier that someone needs to investigate.
That sounds great. And we've got another question from Laura. Can you easily plant trees as a form of restoration after a fire?
Ooh, I don't think anything's easy on serpentine. If I were gonna, if you have property that included serpentine, and if things burned, I mean, probably the first thing I would do is just look to see what comes back because it's amazing what will come back after a fire, either from resprouting or from, serotinous seeds that germinate. And that's probably going to be your best bet. And if you had to plant something, boy, I would just look for a really close seed source, something that, seems capable of growing at that site. But yeah, these soils are just really harsh, and it's the uh, the challenges of getting anything to grow on it when you want to are just that much harder. Um, yeah,
Oh, that's amazing. Um, what are you looking forward to most in your current and future work?
retirement.
No.
Easy question. Actually, honestly, having more time to just go out and botanize, it's easy to get to the point where you're not doing as much field work anymore and caught up in bureaucracy and so on. So I look forward to just, going out and doing more natural history and submitting more iNaturalist reports and stuff like that.
Oh, thank you so much. Yeah, it means so much to me, to everyone, to you, and to everyone who's on here who are submitting iNaturalist reports. It really helps us um,
Oh, that's great.
a better idea of what's going on around us. Yvonne asks, she grew up in the San Miguel Hills tract of San Francisco, and she thinks there was serpentine. Is chert in any way, because chert is red?
Yep, yep. That's
Oh,
part of the ophiolite complex.
okay.
So chert is made of silica from diatoms, and my understanding of it is that if you were in a nearshore environment, there would be all these other sediments raining in, and so the little diatom skeletons would just be kind of nothing, right? But if you're out in the middle of the ocean where these mid-ocean spreading centers are, where the ophiolite is forming, then you have these diatoms raining down into a very kind of barren environment. And so just because there's nothing else there, these diatom skeletons pile up and create this ribbon chert. And that's a signature part of ocean crust rock complexes, in other words, ophiolites. And so you have they call it ophiolite sequence. There's the peridotite, which is the basic mantle material that oozes up in the spreading center. There's the serpentine, the metamorphic product of that. There's gabbro, which is just a kind of a lighter fractionated portion of the peridotite. And then on the very top, there's basalt, which we think of it as a heavy rock, but it's a kind of a lighter version of those same magmatic rocks coming up in the spreading center. And then on top of all that is the chert, which is basically sediment that's dropping down and forming layers in the middle of the deep ocean. And so then all of those things kind of form this complex of rocks and get pushed outward and as an oceanic plate, and eventually little bits of it get scraped up and stranded on the edges of continents. So yeah, the chert is definitely part of the story, and helped geologists figure out where all this stuff was coming from, and basically where new crust comes from.
That's so neat. Yvonne asks if the thermal vents found in California offshore deep underwater preserves are due to serpentinization.
That's a little bit of a complicated question because there are other kinds of oceanic vents, oceanic hydrothermal complexes that aren't related to serpentinization. I mean, the actual spreading center itself has these vents where, we sort of know about them because it's where, gold and silver and precious metals show up. These serpentinization vents happen a little ways away from the actual spreading center. So it's not super hot there. They're actually kind of cold vents. And I read like a nature paper or something that said they happen like maybe 25 kilometers from the spreading center. So that's where this peridotite is getting smushed together with ocean water, which is causing various minerals to be given off, which causes those cold vents to form. So short answer, yeah, there are vents and there are vents. These are not black smokers. Black smokers are the classic hot vents that have the precious metals. These other ones, the serpentinization ones, were actually not even known until I think that science paper that I showed in an earlier slide. It's a relatively recent discovery from one of these submersibles that even found that these things existed.
Oh, that's so neat.
Yeah, isn't it cool?
This is so great. Science is so fun. All right, Kelly's got a good question. Actually, all these questions are good. How dependent, if any, are serpentine plants on fire?
Well, when Hugh Safford and I did this study, this was 1999, we had a big fire in Napa and Lake counties that covered a large area of both serpentine and non-serpentine chaparral. And so we compared burned and unburned locations as a proxy for pre-fire and post-fire. What we found in the non-serpentine chaparral is like dozens and dozens of plants that you essentially don't see except after a fire. Things like Eschscholtzias espitosa, cover entire hillsides, and helianthemum would kind of burst out, and you'd never seen it there before. And there's a lot of things that just they're not 100% fire dependent, but they become 100% more abundant after a fire. Chaparral hillsides look gorgeous after fire. Then there's a few species on non-serpentine that are true fire specialists. Things like Eminanthe penduliflora, which people have shown actually uses smoke as a germination signal. So these things have really evolved to use that kind of post-fire environment. On serpentine, we didn't find any of that. We definitely found species that became more abundant, like little herbs and things. But we didn't find anything that kind of massively increased in abundance, and we didn't find anything that was considered to be a post-fire specialist. So, I mean, I think the short answer is serpentine chaparral, at least, is ecologically, it's sort of like it's always burned, right? There's always sunny open gaps between shrubs. So there is less kind of evolution of species that use fire as the way to get that sunny opening where they do all their reproduction and then go back into the seed bank until the next fire. You just don't really have that so much on serpentine. What you do have is just A lot of shrubs that resprout, a lot of shrubs that come back from seed rather than from sprouting. I think more seeding than sprouting on serpentine, and then just, herbs that become a little bit more abundant after a fire, but they were also there before the fire. So it's just a less fire determined. And it's certainly fire happens there, but it's not as fire determined in terms of maintaining the plant community.
Oh, so interesting. Leslie's asking, is it possible for mushrooms or mycelium to exist in the serpentine soils? I know you talked about not knowing much about or having much info on the mycelium before. Do you know that?
I I've never heard otherwise. Yeah, I don't know. I don't know.
Interesting.
Um, yeah.
Vishnu asks,
Somebody had better get out and start eye-natting some fungal records on serpentine. I can, think of some good places you could go look.
that sounds amazing. Unless he's like, I'm gonna go try it.
Good.
Vishnu's asking, will McNabb and Sargent cypress grow well on non-serpentine soil? And is there a way to serpentinize the soil they are planted in? Wow, Vishnu,
No.
people
Uh-huh.
add serp
Well, Sargent cypress is considered a pretty good serpentine endemic. You really don't see it much off serpentine. There might be a few exceptions, but yeah, I think it's a pretty solid endemic. McNabb's is a little more generalist. In fact, where I'm most familiar with it, you don't find it on the hardcore serpentine. You actually find it on gabbro, which is a kind of a muted, not as chemically extreme related type of rock. And I think in the Sierra foothills, it's also found on other kinds of, not very fertile rocks and soils, but not serpentine per se. So I would say, yeah, Sargent's yes, but McNabb's no, as far as, serpentine dependence.
Nice. That's great. Ivana is asking, are people sampling for unique bacteria in this?
Well, maybe 200 feet under the surface, in the case of people studying these microbes that are involved in, using the chemosynthetic microbes that are using serpentinization as an energy source. But I haven't heard of other microbiological studies on serpentine. They may exist. I don't know of them.
That's so neat.
Mm.
And Ivana also asked, did you say who named it serpentine?
The name actually emerged about 400 years ago. And even before that, I think this name ophiolite was, it may have been around the same time. And I think they might have been trying to think who did this. It was some European scientists, and it was the resemblance of the rock to snake skin. And ophiolite means snake rock, so that's a related piece of terminology. I vaguely remember reading that it was 400 years ago, but yeah, who actually gave it that name? I forget.
Oh, that's really fun. These are such good questions. Wow. And Dennis is asking, do fires occur less on serpentine soil? There's less fuel?
I think that could well be the case sometimes. Yeah. Everything about serpentine is a little bit, it depends. Well, maybe everything about ecology is, it depends. But when Hugh Safford and I did this study, we found that the ages of the stands that burned averaged about 20 years on the non-serpentine soils and about 80 years on the serpentine soils. So at least in that locale at that time, there had been less fire. And that easily could be because what you say, the fuel continuity is less. You have big breaks and openings, and so just the chance for a fire to spread is less. Now, that being said, I think in our modern fire era, all bets are off because we're seeing these fires driven by really intense winds, and then, they can go anywhere and do anything. So I wouldn't count on that to continue in the future, but I think it could be in some settings that fire spread would be reduced and therefore the chance of a given location burning would be less.
That's so interesting. Katie is saying that they heard of our meta-analysis looking at ecological studies and what the most common words are in the winter. It depends.
Yeah. Well, I've for many years teaching ecology, I've always told that to students, and then I've told them, and you know what the next question is?
Oh dear. It depends.
What does it depend on?
Yeah, Vishnu is saying they planted a few Sargent cypress on non-serpentine soil, and so they're looking for a way to amend it to
Oh, uh-huh,
cypress's chances.
uh-huh. Yeah, I don't know. That could be tough because you're going to have a whole suite of things that differ. And I think the microbial communities could be really important there. The kind of the drainage that, just like you can kill some plants by fertilizing them too much or watering them too much. I think that it might be hard in some cases for serpentine species to grow on non-serpentine for those same kinds of reasons. Some will do fine, but if they don't, then I would be skeptical of the ability to fix that. Just like, Pharmonodendron will die if it gets water in the summer. I think some serpentine plants might, or just, lack of drainage. Like every time I try to grow native plants in the yard, the drainage is such a big issue. And so, yeah, I think you just have to try it and find out. I don't know. I don't know how you could really make sure the soil is well drained and then hope for the best.
Okay, that's good to know. Wow, this is so great. And Lena is saying that serpentine was named by a German mineralogist called Georgius Agricola in 15.
Oh, yeah, okay. I've heard that name, Agricola. Don't know anything about the guy. Cool,
That's
thanks.
an interesting name for German. Okay.
Yeah. Well, people gave themselves Latin names. That was a typical thing in the scholarly community because that made you a scholar, like Linnaeus, gave himself the name Linnaeus, for example.
Okay. Thank you
So
very
he,
much.
he Latinized his name so that he could, sound more like a scholar.
Okay. And Yvonne is saying that you must be a wonderful teacher and that you've got very fortunate students. This has been so amazing.
Oh, thanks. It's very nice of you.
All right. Well, it's just about 9 o'clock, and thank you so much for your time and for just such an amazing presentation. Thank you so much for talking with us, and this will be on YouTube for the next time someone says,
Right. What's that crazy stuff, serpentine? Well, thank you for the invitation and really thank you for all the extremely fun questions.
"Yeah, this is such a great team."
Yeah.
It's a really good thing. So, thank you so much. We will be on YouTube, uh, hopefully in a few days, if not a few weeks. We have had a variety of people getting things onto YouTube, so it could
Oh,
just
great. Okay. If you think of it, send me the link. That'd be fun.
I can do that.
All
All
right.
right. Thank you all so much. Thank you, Susan.
Good night.
Man. Good night, everyone.